right. Well, happy whatever day it is I end up deciding to stream this. This is one of my pre-recorded sessions that I am getting ready for my little bit of a sabbatical here. And this episode I am putting together. I don't know whether it's going to end up being a single really long episode or whether I'll end up chopping it into two, just as a heads up. So you'll know by the time this happens because you'll see a second one scheduled. But the topic is about landing your next job in L&D. And the reason that I am taking the time to set this aside and organize it is that just with what's going on in the economy right now, the economic instability, and I just continue hearing stories from people I know and people I encounter who are going through either a potential job loss or they are wondering if they're going to be facing job loss, or they may just be in a situation where there's just so much instability where they are. They're not quite sure if they want to stick it out and they're considering making that next move. So what I thought I would do is just put together some of my thoughts and insights on what that looks like. And I'm coming at it from a couple of different angles. So first of all, I'm going to be sharing some of my own personal experience in job seeking and that whole process. So what has it been like for me and some of my experiences and lessons learned as a job seeker, but also some of the insights that I have. Well, I guess I'm coming at it threefold, because the second one would be I am in a lot of circles with other HR leaders who may not be over L&D, but other parts. And so I have these encounters with kind of how do the systems work, things that really we should know. I've had some really good mentors who are in the talent acquisition space who have shared a lot of wisdom with me. So I'll share some of that perspective. And then I'll also be coming at it from the lens of a hiring manager as a leader in L&D who is regularly evaluating and assessing talent and has hired a number of people over the years. Now, the big warning or subtext or the language that I'll put around this is, please keep in mind that this is from the point of view of Christopher Lynn. I am in no way, shape, or form saying what I have to say is the absolute best answer to everything or best recommendation, or that I don't ever want anybody to come back to me and go, well, I did what you said and it didn't work for me. Because, hey, you know what? Again, this is my experience and some of the lessons I've learned through the School of Hard Knocks along the way. So I want to add that caveat to it just to make sure it's clear how I'm approaching this. I am not approaching this as though I have all the answers. And if you do exactly what Christopher says, you will magically land your next best job with that. But again, that's a little bit of the background behind it, some of the why I thought I would do this episode, and then also the warning behind that, so that you understand that I'm not promising you that if you follow the instructions in this podcast, you will land your next job. However, I do feel that it will be a big help. And hopefully those of you listening, whether you're currently out of a job or facing that, I know how hard that is. I've been through that personally. I know how very hard that is. So I want to make sure I am conveying with all sincerity that my heart goes out to you right now. I know this is a very stressful time and it can be very challenging, not only just wondering what's next, but also just on your own self-worth and evaluating your identity. And it just brings a lot of things out. So my encouragement to you to hang in there, that there will be something on the other side, and just stick with it. But hopefully what I share will hopefully help you get through this difficult time. But this is I'm not a magic formula, but hopefully there are some magic ingredients that help you along the way. The other thing that I want to say that I sometimes see when it comes to hiring advice or career advice or things like this, when people are doing this, a lot of times I encounter stuff that doesn't highlight the fact that the reality is there's just a whole lot of hard work that goes into this, that it's not something that there is no magic hack or magic something that if you do it, you can just skip. At least I haven't found it. I have not encountered anything that magically I wave my wand, and if I just do these 3 secret steps, then I can skip over everything and land your next job. Now, I know there are seasons where that can happen and things can move quickly. And certainly there are times where the stars all line up and things move quickly. But in general, my experience has been there is a lot of hard work that goes into this. And there's a lot of disappointment and a lot of effort that feels like it's wasted effort. And what I would say to those of you who may be in this situation, or even those of you who are maybe considering it, is instead of looking at all that hard work as wasted effort, I would encourage you to look at it as an opportunity for your development. Sometimes I talk to people and they're frustrated because they feel like they've put a lot of time into interviewing only to not get the jobs. And what I encourage them in that is to say, hey, use that as an opportunity to say, how am I getting better at interviewing? Don't keep, if you're just going into interview after interview doing the exact same thing you did before, that might be part of the problem. And so how do you then look at that and say, okay, how can I use this as a development opportunity? So that's a little bit of the intro that I want to share there. And then I'm going to break this down into essentially 5 chunks that I'm going to structure this by. And I will timestamp this in the live replay so you can go back. Whether I get to all 5 of these or 4 of these, I think, in this time, we'll see. I'll keep an eye on the clock. And if it gets too long, then I'll just chop it up. But the first one is the whole skill building and staying relevant. I think that's an important part of the job piece that I want to get into. And I've got a fair amount of stuff that I'll talk about that and just share perspective and reflections on that. So the skill building and staying relevant in the field, in the industry. The second one I'll tackle is networking and how to use that in your job search, how to do it well. Some of the lessons that I've learned over the years in terms of actual networking. Then I'm going to jump into the actually standing out in the application game. And that is, to me, that's one of the most grueling parts, is when you feel like you're just doing application after application after application, and it just seems to go into the ether. And some of my experiences and some of the lessons I've learned and some of the things that people have done that have really stood out to me in that. So that's the third one. And then the last one is the actual interviewing piece. Now, I was going to continue on and get into the job offer, the whole negotiation side of things, and then starting with success. But I think I'll actually leave that, because to me, that's when you land the job. You land the job, you get the offer. That's the beyond. So this whole first section is just going to be on the leading up to actually landing the job and what you can do for that. So let's start with the skill building, staying relevant, and some of the top things that I end up discussing with folks when they're talking about looking for a new job, or they're out of work and they're trying to land something, or they're considering the next thing. And one of the questions that comes up a fair amount is formal certifications and education. And I get this whether people are actually out of work and looking for a job, or just in general. I get asked a lot. And there was a question I had a lot earlier in my career is, should I pursue a formal certification like a CPLP, or should I do PMP or something like that? Do I go back and get my master's degree? Things like that. Here's Christopher Lynn's take on this whole topic. I always encourage people, when they say they want to consider this, what is your ultimate goal in pursuing this? Because I often have seen people go down this path with the goal of, well, by getting this, I'm going to increase my marketability. I'm going to improve my chances of landing my next job. And I personally get a little leery when I hear people say that's why they want to do this. Now, is there still some stake in, do certain certifications in some circles hold certain credibility, and does having a master's degree with certain people carry more weight than somebody who doesn't? Yes. And what I've seen and personally have experienced is that the folks who do really well, these formal certifications are not really the differentiator in them. The folks that I've seen be really successful and have moved forward and have taken on bigger things, or have landed the job that they really were seeking, they didn't do it by going out and checking a box and ending up with another 3-letter acronym at the end of their name on LinkedIn. Now, that's not to say don't do it. I would be a hypocrite if I did. I pursued a graduate degree. I have my master's and bachelor's in education. So for me to say don't do it, you don't need to, nobody needs a college, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case. I did it because for me, it was more of a personal goal that I wanted to do. It was something that I aspired to. I also saw it as an opportunity for me to build connections with other folks in the field. So it was more of a holistic approach to the degree than it was, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to rush through and check all the boxes. And then at the end, I'm going to have this nice little certificate that I think is going to get me a better job. Quite frankly, my master's degree has, in my experience, done little to nothing from a career trajectory standpoint. Nobody has ever said, wow, you seem so much more capable of doing this job because you have a master's degree. Now, am I glad I did it? Yes. Do I look back at that and say, I wish I hadn't gone to the effort of going through that because it was a lot of work? It was really stressful. I have debated whether I would go on and do my PhD. But again, it's one of those, would I ever discourage somebody from doing it? Only if I felt like you're doing it because you think the sheer act of completing the certification or getting this degree is going to be what ultimately lands you that. Now, that's my take on this. I've had some folks who have had a lot of success with this and have ended up doing it. I think the biggest thing that I always encourage people when they're thinking about pursuing first of all, one, financially, is it going to put you in the lurch on this? Then you really should probably think deeply about whether that's the right thing to do, because are you going to automatically return that? That's where I have not seen that pay off. And again, I would just encourage those of you who may be feeling like, I just don't know that that's really I don't really have the desire to do that, but should I feel obligated to be successful in the field? To those of you who may be feeling that way, I would say by no means feel that a certification or a degree is preventing you from being successful in the field. I have seen lots of people be wildly successful in the field, and some of the greatest folks I know in our field are not certified, degreed, pedigreed, and all of these things. But it can be a worthwhile thing. One thing that I think I have seen it be really helpful for folks is if they did not come from a background in human development or psychology. I had the benefit of having an undergraduate degree in education where I had to do a lot of the prerequisites. I had to learn all of this stuff as part of my undergrad. I know a lot of folks who did not have that, and so they've had to learn, and it has been really helpful for them to go back for that. Now, this is where I'm going to transition to, if that's a gap that you're filling, if it's a knowledge gap or a gap in that, I don't think you necessarily need to feel obligated to have a paid. There's a lot of free resources and classes and courses out there. There are a lot of free resources, edX, Coursera. I mean, you name YouTube, even if you really just want to learn about human psychology or learning theory or some of the research behind it. There are a lot of ways that you can fill that knowledge gap. And honestly, even things like podcasts where you listen to people who are practitioners in the field dig into some of the nuance and the complexity of some of this. In some regards, I feel like there's more richness sometimes in that than going through a traditional thing. Now, that's not to say that's always the case. I think one of the differentiators that I would say, if you were considering a formal certification or something like that, is evaluating what kind of evidence does it have to show that I can actually showcase I have developed skill, not just, hey, I did a thing and I have a badge, but it actually has, and does it have a reputation in the industry for people who come out of this actually are more skilled in this? Now, where a degree in formal certification can be helpful if you're coming in from outside of the industry and you're looking to break in. To be completely honest, sometimes L&D can be a little bit snobby when it comes to this. We can be a little snobby about, whoa, you don't have formal experience or a degree type of a thing. A degree can help break some of that versus some of these informal, and you're constantly doing the storytelling of explaining how you do know it, even though you don't have the credentials to back that. I think that's one of the things that we have to watch for in that. The other question, the other one that comes up kind of in this vein of formal degree versus just one extreme is super formal degree program or really robust certification. Then on the other side is, we'll just go away from that and just do something like informal, find resources freely available and do all that kind of stuff. I think in the middle, Some of the things that I've seen is there has been a rise. There has been a rise of these, I don't even know what they're called, but I see a fair amount of them where you can sign up and learn to be an instructional designer for in 8 weeks and land a job in this. Now, if you listen to some of the folks in the industry who are much more intimately familiar with them, the one thing I would say with that is be very careful in some of these programs. There are a lot of programs out there that are promising that if you go through this program, you will land a job in the field in 8 weeks or whatever it is. Like I said, I don't know all of them terribly intimately. I know some of them that are very rich and robust and led by people who are very well qualified to run those programs. And they're doing a great job helping people build the skills they need to land in our industry and are very supportive of helping people make that transition or skilling them up to make that. And I've actually hired some people who have gone through that, and that's been what's helped them make it in. And it has done well, but there are also plenty of them out there that are looking to just take your money, quite frankly. So what I would say is go into that with open eyes and be cautious, ask lots of questions, talk to people who've been involved with them. Anything that you're going to be paying money for that is looking to develop you or skill you or certify you in something in the field, just go in with open eyes and a curious mind and some real discernment on that to determine, is this something that is going to adequately prepare me and give me skills I don't have and a knowledge base I don't have that is truly going to translate into landing a new or better job in the field? Or is this just I want to take your money and teach you some basic tricks that you could have picked up on YouTube and then send you on your way type of a thing? So just be careful with that. So that's, to me, the spectrum that I see right now in terms of the traditional formal development, either one just completely off the rails, find it yourself, do it yourself type thing, resources, super formal, you go back, get your master's degree or undergrad if you really want to do an undergrad in education type of a thing. And then in the middle are these little boot camps or whatever they're calling themselves now type of a thing. And again, I have mixed feelings. I will say, I would encourage anybody, don't just take what I say on this one as that's what I'm going to do one way or the other, just given the fact that there is a lot of nuance to everyone's personal situations. And when I talk to people individually, a lot of times as I get to know their background, their skill set, what they're really trying to do, sometimes one of these paths makes more sense than others. So I think, if anything, the lesson you can take away from that is don't go into any of them without putting some real thought and discernment into the path and why are you doing it and what are you hoping to get out of it? Because I've seen no shortage of empty promises that don't deliver. I've also seen people who have really done well with that. So that may sound like a do it or don't do it, but hopefully that gives enough color behind my answers to help give some wisdom on how to think about it. Now, I also want to talk about some more action-based development opportunities that I think often go underutilized in our industry when it comes to this kind of stuff. One of the ones that I think can be really helpful for people, and this is maybe a newer category of things, is micro consulting or doing smaller jobs for folks and finding some opportunities where you might be able to lean on some projects that isn't a full-time role. It's also not necessarily a full-time consulting role. Picking up, this is the moonlighting, side hustle work. I heard it on a podcast. I don't remember who was the one who said this. It was a couple years ago, but essentially it was talking about the fact that in this whole skills economy, for the most part, you almost have to think of a side hustle as just something that you do as part of your own professional development. Now, am I encouraging everyone to go out and do a side hustle? No, not necessarily. However, can it be something that can be really helpful where you may be either out of a job and looking for another full-time role, but you want to do something in the middle to bridge that gap, or you may be in a full-time role, not necessarily super thrilled with where it's going, feeling like you're struggling, and you want to do something else with your skills, and the organization just isn't ready to do something with those skills. To that, I think, say that's where doing some micro consulting or small things on the side may actually be an opportunity for you. Now, you can go the full length on this and actually set up an LLC, create your own company, which I think sometimes people steer away from that because they think it's a lot of work. It's a much easier process than you may realize to go to InkFile or one of these companies and set up an LLC and set yourself up as a company to be able to offer services to folks and be protected under LLC versus just John Woods, whatever, doing your own thing type of thing. But this may be an opportunity for you to actually lean in and do some of this work without necessarily taking that on as a full-time job. I've seen a lot of folks who have lost their jobs. This is one of the cautions that I was given when I was going through some things, is to be careful when you're out of a job. If you truly are looking for full-time employment, it can be challenging to try and weigh doing, I'll do some consulting and I'm going to look for a full-time job. The commitment split, I don't know very many folks that I've encountered over the years that have been able to navigate that split commitment terribly well, especially when they're seeking the full-time employment. Do I know folks who have been able to be in a full-time job and do some moonlight work on the side, some light micro consulting? That's different than I'm in the throes of trying to find a full-time job and all the interviewing and all the seeking and all the networking and everything that goes with it. Oh, and by the way, I'm also trying to do some moonlight projects. That, I don't know, would be my recommendation as the best way to approach it. If you're looking for full-time employment, I would say dive in head first. Make looking for your next full-time role the main thing. If you are thinking, hey, you know what, maybe I don't want to do a full-time, well, then make that decision and go that path. That has been what I've observed with people I know who have gone through this journey, and that's been a number of folks. And when I see people completely split their time and attention, it is not something that I've seen typically go super well. But this can be an opportunity, especially if you're in that stage where you're uncertain about your job. There's a lot of uncertainty. You're not sure where it's going to go. You're not sure what this looks like. And maybe you don't quite feel you're at a point where you have the skills, or you'd like to expand your skill set, but not in a new full-time job where you would be held fully accountable to that. That's where micro consulting or picking up some of this moonlight work can be a really, really great way to do it. Now, the one thing I will caution people on that often jump out of full-time employment and go into the consulting world is there is a lot more to it than people often realize. And one of the biggest challenges is the business development side, finding work and actually building a reputation and brand, which is part of one of the things I'll talk about later. That is a lot of work with that. Now, one of the areas that you might be able to bridge this, and this is something that I've seen people do really well, and I actually did this early in the pandemic myself, was volunteering in non-traditional channels. It's one thing to try and get somebody to pay you money to do work for them. It's another thing to say, hey, I have some additional free time and I see an opportunity. I really want to help you just make the transition through this. And I have some skills that I think will help bridge that gap. It is much easier to find people who will take volunteer help than it is to find people who will say, hey, will you pay me to do some of these things? And this can be a really creative way. One of the ways, I'll just give an example from myself that I did, was when the pandemic first hit, I saw what was happening in the education space and how schools were struggling to make this transition. And I had a lot of, with my background in K-12, I had a lot of teachers, friends who were going, how do we do this whole virtual thing? And we got all this technology and all of this stuff. And it was unfamiliar territory to them. Now, having been in the corporate sector, leading learning transformation and digital for a long time, this was my bread and butter. So to me, this was something where I really wanted to help, not only because I saw a lot of struggling teachers and a lot of struggling school systems, but as a father of 6, I have a personal stake in the development of the next generation of kids. And so for me, this wasn't so much for me keeping my skills sharp, so much as I saw a major problem, a major hole in our society. And I said, I'm going to lean in to this. And similar, there were some churches that I saw a similar thing. They were just trying to figure out what they were supposed to do as their congregations couldn't come and gather in person type of a thing. And schools, same thing. How do we work with students when they're not there? Are there still plenty of schools and not churches, non-traditional areas and sectors that are struggling, we think we may be behind in the corporate sector? Trust me, there are lots of other areas that are still languishing with this whole transition through the pandemic, and how do we move digital, and how do we do some of these other things? And being able to volunteer in that and offer your services and say, hey, I can help with some of this stuff. I can help in a number of different ways. It may be creating digital content. It may be coaching and developing some of these folks transition through these things. And these are great ways not only to take the skills that you have and pay it forward and better humanity, but also to be able to speak to some of the ways you're going above and beyond the call of duty with your skills and continuing to grow and develop and work in creative environments that you may not have worked before. This gives you a lot of content in some ways to speak to when you're trying to highlight yourself and showcase what you bring to the table when it comes to seeking that job thing. Now, the one thing I will say with this one that I think is really important, I think there's a lot of pros to it in terms of it's much easier to get somebody to take volunteer versus asking them to pay you. So it's a great way to get started. It's a great way to lean in. There's a lot of opportunity to benefit humanity with this whole thing. At the same time, anybody who's doing this, I would caution you to be very careful, because this can also become all-consuming, and very quickly you can end up overcommitted to things that maybe you don't have the capacity to, or figuring out how do you transition out. So if you're going into this, just like you would with any consulting type project, you want to be really clear what you're signing up to do, and you're really practicing exercising strong boundaries. Because where I have seen this go south, and even some of the battles myself when I was doing this, when people were just grasping for air at the beginning of the pandemic, was somebody signing up to offer free service and help with something. There can be a tendency to, just like a drowning person, grab on and push them underwater. So you have to be prepared for that and know how, I'm using the lifeguard analogy with this, know how to put your arm around the neck and pull them to shore without letting them be able to pull you down under. And I think that's a really important thing, because I have seen some folks lean into this, and as a result, they end up overcommitted, and it's actually taking them away from being able to either do their job well. Now they're putting their current job at risk instead of just helping on the side, doing things like this. It suddenly becomes an overcommitment, and now they're sacrificing in areas they don't mean to. Or if they're out of work, it's actually preventing them from being able to focus their attention on landing that next job. So that's the caution. That's the piece I would add to this, in terms of just be very careful if you go down this route. People will often love to take free service from people, but I've seen plenty of my friends in the consulting space say there is a very dangerous line you can walk with this, where pretty soon you can be taken advantage of. So again, just like with some of these other things like the boot camps or even a certification or credential, you need to go into this exercising a fair amount of discernment and be shrewd in how you approach it, but generous at the same time. So I think that's the thing there. But again, another great opportunity for you to be active. The last thing you want to do if you're out of work is be stagnant. That is the absolute last thing that you want to do, is be stagnant. So anything you can be doing to keep you relevant, current, active is going to be helpful, not only for your own well-being, but also for you being competitive in the job market. So there's actually a twofold benefit to that. Now, the other thing I think that I would really add to this is, whatever you're doing with any of these skill building, staying relevant things, this is probably the biggest caution or watch out, I guess, whatever you want to call it, that I would say is, be sure that you are balancing the scales of acquiring new knowledge with opportunities to actually apply and exercise that knowledge. one of the biggest pitfalls I've seen when people go about skill building, and this isn't just unique to our industry, but we're seeing this as the whole skills thing is picking up, is there is a lot of things out there focused on the knowledge acquisition side of it. How do we acquire more knowledge? How do we fill our heads with all this great stuff? But it's not necessarily laser focused on the actual application and development of the skills. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze here. Oh, thank you. All right. I don't know who I was thanking there. Anyway, so I think that's just one of my big takeaways with this, or my big recommendations with this, is just make sure that whatever you're doing, yes, it's good to be listening to podcasts, watching videos, taking classes, doing things like that. Those are all good things, but make sure you're balancing that out with seeking out those opportunities to actually apply those skills and do something with those skills, so that you're actually growing the skill versus just sounding really good and being able to speak well to it without necessarily being able to back it with effort. Okay, so I'm going to, let me make a note here where I am from a timing standpoint. I definitely think I am going to break this into two because this is going longer than I anticipated. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the networking piece. And to be clear on this, I'm going to share a little bit of my background and my story on this, because the reality is networking has historically, in the past, was always a very difficult thing for me. For those of you who don't know, I am extremely introverted, which a lot of people don't believe because of how much content I put out and how boisterous, I guess would be a word, I can be sometimes. But realistically, traditional networking for me has always been difficult. And I remember early in my career, I was told in order to be successful in your career, you're going to have to get out there. And when I was given this feedback, the individual literally meant physically get out there, go to conferences, go to events, go to networking dinners and lunches, and insert yourself into all of these different things, which for me was kryptonite. It honestly was. Now, I know there are plenty of folks who may listen and watch this who love that. And to you, that's your jam. Kudos to you. I probably will not be speaking to that side of it, because to me, that's kryptonite. So are you going to find me I get emails all the time asking, hey, do you want to get together for this L&D leaders dinner? No. And some of it's just practically speaking, that's dinner time for me and my family. And no, I'm not going to give that up to go have awkward small talk with folks. Personal opinion. So for me, that just isn't something that I am going to invest in. And now, again, I know folks who do that. They enjoy it and they get a lot of value out of that. And if that's you and you say, who are those people? I am happy to tell you who some of those folks are. Message me offline. I can point you in the direction of folks who are super active, outgoing, doing all of these, involved in all of this other stuff. My personal piece is not only because as an introvert, those things are kryptonite, but the thing that I'm always assessing is, and I actually made some notes on this the other day, I'm extremely disciplined with how I spend my time. So the way I spend my time matters a lot. And to me, I look at some of those things and I go, there's a fair amount of time spent on that. The travel, the time actually at the thing, any sort of follow-up type of thing. And so for me, when I do the overall value equation, and again, I'm not expecting people to take Christopher's value equation and apply it to them. But for me, when I've done the value equation to how much time and energy and effort and fatigue I end up with taking the traditional networking channels, it's not, the value prop just isn't there. It hasn't been there. Now, going back to this early advice I got in my career, I was essentially told, if you don't do that, you will not be successful. I wouldn't consider myself successful necessarily, but I would say I've done pretty well from a networking and a branding standpoint. And so I have not leaned into the traditional methods. So what I would say to people is, even if you are the one who loves doing that stuff, What I would caution you about is be careful that you don't believe the lie. It's a lie, in my opinion, that you have to do those things in order to be successful. You have to network through traditional channels and in traditional ways in order to be successful. That was the feedback I was given early in my career. I chose to ignore it and get creative about, let me figure out what's at the core of what those important things are that occur in there. And let me see if I can replicate that in a way that works better for me as an introvert. And also, my opinion was more efficient. It was a more efficient way to do that. So let me get into a couple of different things on here. Building a brand for yourself. This is really important to landing your next job. And that may sound overwhelming hearing me say that, because you may look, let's say, at my LinkedIn and go, good grief, I just cannot imagine a world generating or creating that much content. That is not what I'm talking about. I don't think everyone needs to have a live stream. I've heard feedback, you have to have a podcast for your personal brand. You don't have to have a podcast for your personal brand. Should you be putting effort and discipline into building some sort of brand for yourself? My answer to that would be absolutely. If you are not putting in effort into your personal brand, you need to be. Now, this is good advice for folks, whether you currently are out of a job or considering looking for a new job or not. Because quite frankly, the one thing to note about this is not something that happens overnight. You don't decide to start building a brand about yourself and you do it, and 3 weeks later, you've got a brand that everybody recognizes. You're playing the long game with this. And so one of the things that I would encourage folks is, as you build your brand, you're going to need to take some time to personally think about what part, and this is something that I think is going to be really helpful for you as you start looking and landing your job in L&D, is thinking deeply about, what is it about this field that really gets me out of bed in the morning? What are the things that I'm really intrigued by, or that really excite me, that I really love spending time about? Now, does that mean that that's going to be the only thing you do in L&D? No, not necessarily. As an example, part of my brand is learning technology. Is technology the only thing I care about in learning? No, not at all. I'm actually fascinated by all aspects of it. However, I had to make an intentional decision on what was the thing that I wanted to be essentially the jumping off point for what I do in the space. And I think that's an important exercise for those of you who may be in this space where you're looking at landing that next job and saying, what about L&D do I really want to be associated with when I think about that? Again, not limiting that's the only thing that you will do, but what part do I really want to stand out? A person I think who has done a fantastic job in this, Kevin Yates. I'll shout out to you, Kevin. The learning detective. Do I think Kevin is only capable of doing learning evaluation and assessment? No, he's capable of far more than that in learning and development. However, he's done a really good job creating that brand around himself as the learning detective. Now, do you have to go to the lengths that Kevin has to build that brand? No, but I do think the intention of saying, what of L&D do I really want to be associated with as I think about this, is a really important piece, because it's going to help, as you see standing out in the interview piece, it's going to help you start to be able to build and tell those really compelling stories that are going to help you stand out. Now, when it comes to building your brand, sometimes people say, what's an effective way to do that? There are a million different ways that you can do this. And I've seen people, trying to think of some of the folks I know, but I know some folks who are really active on doing it. They're doing it in Clubhouse. I know some folks who are doing some cool TikTok stuff. I know some folks who are doing some really neat stuff on Instagram to help differentiate themselves, and Facebook and other areas. One of the key things you're probably hearing here is social media is a great way to build your brand to a large audience. But one that I think just cannot be overlooked, regardless of where you really invest your brand. Because again, could you do a podcast? Sure. Could a podcast be really helpful in building your brand? Absolutely. It can be a fantastic way to do it. Should everyone go create an L&D podcast? No, I wouldn't advocate for that in any way, shape, or form. But one thing that I would universally say, to any professional right now, is Don't let your LinkedIn just be a passive alternative version of your resume. This is one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen for folks when it comes to brand building and just in general, networking, career mobility, building out, finding that next job. The reality is, and I'm speaking to as a hiring man, I'll just tell you from my behavior. The first thing I do when I see a candidate come through who applies for a job, the first thing I do is look them up on LinkedIn. And that is a behavior that is pretty common, quite frankly. Many people, when they get, now some people would say, well, they'll Google them, which again, I'm going to talk a little bit about why using LinkedIn and being active on LinkedIn and not just letting it be this passive place that you go to and occasionally scroll through and look what's on there is actually really important in terms of your own search engine optimization and how are you found on the internet type of a thing. LinkedIn is a really, really powerful way to control this. And it is the professional social media source. And so if your LinkedIn is either you don't have one or you haven't been out there forever, and so you're not active at all, to me, you are missing a huge opportunity to not only build your brand, but also be able to show people who you are outside of what a piece of paper says about you. No matter how well crafted your LinkedIn is, or no matter how well crafted your resume is, it doesn't necessarily give people a whole lot of insight to what's going on between your ears and the way you think about things, the positions you take on things, how you think critically about different things. And LinkedIn is a really fantastic place for you to be able to do that and not just copy your resume and put it out there. Should you do that? I mean, not necessarily just copy your resume, but should part of your resume showing your career history, should that be on LinkedIn? Yes. But should that be the only thing that's out there? I think you're missing a massive opportunity to do that. And again, this can sound overwhelming for people who may be more of the passive consumer of social media versus the active participant. I've coached a lot of people as they've gone through this and tried to figure out, how do I use LinkedIn then? Because I'm not a content creator. I'm not someone who's going to start generating selfie videos or doing all this. That feels overwhelming to me. And that may be where you get to, but that may not be where you start. Some of the things that just on a foundational level, I encourage people when it comes to using LinkedIn, don't be the person that either does nothing with it or only goes through and hits like on a bunch of stuff. Hitting like on a bunch of stuff, while yes, it will show up in your activity feed, doesn't really tell anyone much of anything about who you are as a professional and what you have to showcase. I think one of the earliest steps that people can take to help build a little bit of a brand, and actually this will dual with the networking piece as well, is put thoughtful comments on other people's content. See what other people are posting and reflect on what they had to say, come up with a really thoughtful response to what they have to say and share it. That is a really easy way to start showcasing the way you think and the way you work and how you position yourself in the space. And being able to do that, one, not only does it help, but it's actually going to start building relationships with you in the network. And I think that's a really important piece. And it makes it easy. Instead of feeling like I've got to come up with writing my own long form content or my own short form content, it's an easy way to start getting a feel for what is your voice? What is the voice you want to present out to the world? And how do you do that? And I think commenting, sharing, another great way to start small is to read an article and pick out a few thoughts. I've seen some people who take articles and they just copy and paste the text from the article and put it in quotes and share it. To me, I feel like that doesn't really show me much of anything other than, to me, this would be the equivalent of check the box exercise type stuff. This shows me you may have read it. That's about all it tells me about you. You may have read it and maybe this is something that stood out to you. But for all I know, you just scrolled through, found a paragraph or a few sentences and copy and pasted and then shared the article type of thing, trying to show that you read the article. To me, I don't think it says a whole lot versus someone who reads an article and shares a few insights that they had from the article or a position that they've taken. Or sometimes I love when people take a contradictory approach. I read this, I would actually challenge this. That to me, and again, this is me speaking as a hiring manager, that to me speaks to this is how this person is thinking critically about these things and the point of view that they bring and the skill and knowledge that they bring to the table as it comes to things. And this can be a really easy entry level way for you to start building a little bit of a brand around yourself, because people can start to see who you are. And believe me, I don't think I'm alone in this, but this is the kind of stuff I do when I get a resume or somebody applies to a job that I'm either aware of on my team or that reports directly to me. One of the first things I do is go look at somebody's LinkedIn and I go to their activity feed. I'm not necessarily interested in what all their jobs are. I can look at the resume to see that. But what I am interested in is, are they someone who's actively engaged in the community that is learning and development? Are they engaging with their peers? Are they someone who's involved in some of this stuff? And I think that's a really important thing that I often see is missed. The number of people I see on LinkedIn who, if you go to their profile, and I'll just speak to like when I'm hiring, the number of people I see when I go to their profile and it's either just bare bones or there's maybe a copy of their resume and no activity in the last 90 days. The opportunity you're missing is, let's just say I'm that hiring manager, is you're missing an opportunity to tell me a little bit of a story about who you are and how you think about our field and the kind of thoughtfulness and critical thinking you put in to the work that I would, as a potential hiring manager, be asking you to do. And I think that's an opportunity that you don't want to miss. You just don't want to miss it. So regardless of whether you're doing other things, to me, that's one that consistently hiring managers, they're looking at LinkedIn. There's also opportunities for you to see who is connected at that company. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the virtual coffee type spot. But there's lots of benefits aside from just being able to tell a little bit of a story about that. But I think that's a huge one. That's a huge one. And I know a lot of hiring managers in my circles that is our first behavior. We find someone, first thing we do is go look at their LinkedIn. You might do a podcast and that might be fine and dandy, but you have to then assume that the behavior of that hiring manager is they're going to go to iTunes and look up to see if you're on a podcast. That's way outside the trail of things that I'm going to do. Now, if somebody applies and shares, hey, I did this podcast type of a thing, then I may listen to it. But again, you're talking long form content, a lot of other things there's a lot of barriers to somebody finding that. The story you can tell on LinkedIn is actually a very quick way. So again, if you're doing a podcast, if you do decide to do a podcast or you are doing other things, sharing it on LinkedIn is pretty much a well-guaranteed way to make sure that that information is going to get in front of a person who is considering you for a role, whether that be a recruiter, whether that be the hiring manager, whether it be other team people on the hiring team. It's a really powerful way to get in front of that. So I just want to put that out there because I do think building that brand, it's not just about this ego trip, building a brand around yourself. It's more so being able to tell a story about what you bring to the space through different channels. And I think that mindset shift is really important, because if you come across as an arrogant blowhard, that's not necessarily, at least if I was hiring you, if that's how you come across to me, you're going to immediately be checked off my list of candidates I'm going to consider. Okay, 3 other things, and then I am actually going to hit stop and I will record the other 2 as a separate one, is conferences. What's my take on conferences on this? I would put it, for the most part, if it's a consumption of stuff, if you're just going and attending things, maybe a little bit active in the chat. It could be tied, or if you're actually going to a conference, maybe you could say it's a networking thing. I really think of conferences as more of like in the skill building, staying relevant. If you want to go hear what people are doing, if you're in the consumption side of it, if you're the person who's consuming the information, just going as a passive participant, are there opportunities where you can do more with it from a networking standpoint, get to know people, do some of these other things? Yes. If you are thinking more on the conference side, one of the things I encourage people to do all the time, and even for me, if I'm involved in a conference a lot of times, it's because I'm speaking at it. And I encourage people a lot of times to actually speak at conferences. Again, going back to some of it is, it's an opportunity to build a little bit more about your brand and how you think about things and some of the work that you've done. It's a great opportunity to do that. Also, something you can share on LinkedIn that then tells a potential hiring manager, hey, I'm someone who is out here speaking on this. I have a point of view. I'm contributing to the industry. But also, and this was for me more as an introvert, if you're the person presenting, it's a whole lot easier for people to want to come up and engage with you versus feeling like you have to go try and engage with others. So I think that's one of the things when I talk about conferences. Personally, do I think there's a ton of value in spending a bunch of money and flying around and being a passive participant at these cool venues and doing that? I think there's personally other ways that you can accomplish some of that stuff, but I don't want to dismiss it as any sort of value, because I do know a lot of folks who get a lot of value out of it. I think it's what you do at that conference that's going to be the differentiator. If you're the person that just shows up, sits in the back, listens to a bunch of presentations, maybe says hi to a few people that you recognize, that you're familiar with, which I think that's another one of the misses. If you're only talking to people in your echo chamber, you're actually missing opportunities. So if all you do is either go sit quietly, stay in the back, or only talk to people you're already familiar with and then just go home, it's no different than the practice we try and talk against in L&D, where we say, don't just send people off to training and then have them come back and do nothing with it. And a lot of times that's the behavior I see when I see people approaching conferences. They approach it very much the way we tell people not to approach training. Don't approach training as this one-time event that you go do, and then by the time you get back to the plane, you've done nothing else with it, and you'd never do anything with it after. If conferences are your thing, I would encourage people, do as much as you can to actually be on the circuit and speak so that you can actually build more of your brand and build more connections with folks. But if that's not your jam, or maybe the public speaking thing isn't for you, at least maximize that time to build meaningful connections outside of the people that you regularly interact with, and follow up with those people afterwards. The number of people I know who see people, but they only talk to them at the conferences, I'm like, you are missing opportunities to stay connected to this. The other one that I'm going to talk about is the virtual coffees piece. This is one of the things that I would, going back to where I said, if there's one thing I would universally tell people, it's have a LinkedIn and be active on LinkedIn. Have a LinkedIn and be active on LinkedIn. It is a surefire way to at least get a brand around you communicated to potential hiring managers or people who would be considering you. That is a surefire. Another thing that I would just say universally, every single person who is looking at landing their next job in L&D or considering another move or whatever it is, my best advice is you need to be doing virtual coffees. It is the most inobtrusive. Is that a word? I don't know if that's a word. It is one of the easiest ways that you can connect with other people and get to know them at a meaningful level, actually engage with folks, and build a network of professionals who can help you be successful in the field without having to wait until the next conference and hope that the people you want to interact with are there. This can be a little bit scary for folks. And even for myself, I don't know that I ever really struggled with this one, even as an introvert. I grew up and was very much always grew up. My dad was always one who was like, what's the worst thing that happens if you ask? Someone says no. So I've always been someone who's thought, well, what the heck? What's the worst that happens? I'll ask and somebody's going to say no, or they're going to ignore me. But even if you're someone who's like, I don't know how comfortable I feel with this, this is something that I think everybody can do, because at this point, everybody can get there's a free meeting tool that you can find to set something up. Heck, LinkedIn now has its own built-in video conferencing tool. If you're not familiar, I'm not plugging LinkedIn just because, other than I think there's a lot of power to it that vastly goes underutilized, but it has a built-in video messaging tool so that if you actually want to do a virtual coffee with someone you connect with, you don't even have to have your own Zoom account or anything. You can do it right through there. Now, to me, do I think there's benefits to using an actual meeting tool so you can send a calendar invite and not have to worry about will they join and all this other stuff? Yes. The biggest thing that I tell people when it comes to virtual coffees, couple things is, first of all, one, when you reach out and talk to people, one, don't just talk to people that are in the roles you think you want or people that you think are hiring for it. Talk to people from other parts of the business, maybe potential roles that may be sister or brother roles to us, sales enablement, customer success. Try and use virtual coffees to get a broader perspective into where might I be able to get other career insights. Talk to people from other functions at companies you see yourself working at. There's a lot of opportunity for you to get to know people deeply without actually ever being in the same room as them. And I think virtual coffees, whether you call them that or not, is one of the easiest ways to do it. Connect with people that you think are interesting to you, that you'd like to learn more about, who may work at companies that you're interested in. You'd like to know what it's like to work there, but be clear that that's what you want to do. I think this is the other thing I tell people that can be really helpful with this is just know when you reach out for virtual coffees, there is an ongoing assumption. I'm going to go to guess because I know I have it. When somebody reaches out and asks about a virtual coffee, if they don't address the elephant in the room, my assumption is this person's looking for a job and they want me to help with that, which may not necessarily be a bad thing, but recognize that may reduce your acceptance rate. Because some people feel really uncomfortable having a conversation with someone. They feel like the only reason you're talking to me is you want a job, and I may not know of jobs. I may not be comfortable doing something about it, type of a thing. So the one piece of advice that I would give to people when you're reaching out to folks asking about a virtual coffee is address the elephant in the room and just acknowledge that, if you are looking to them for a job, because it is a specific one, be upfront about it. Be upfront about it and give them an out. So if you think you're connecting with someone who might know about the job, be upfront about the fact that I'm looking at learning more about this job. If you don't actually know anything about it, that's okay. Let me know so that they have an out. But I think the other thing is, and this is one of the things that I would encourage people to do this, don't wait until you need a job to connect and get to know people. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes people make. And we've all probably been that person where you get the message from someone you haven't talked to in who knows how long, and suddenly they want to randomly catch up. And you go, let me guess, like, I don't even have to guess what's happening. I probably know what it is you're looking for, and it's probably you're out of work. Now, I don't necessarily think there's anything bad with that, but you got to recognize that that creates a little bit of a stigma around the conversation versus if you're doing this when you don't need a job, it is much less awkward of a conversation. And that's where I would say, even if you're not looking for a job, you're not out of work, I encourage everybody I talk to, you should be having virtual coffees with people. Those things should be peppered on your calendar throughout the month, regardless of your job career status. You should be doing these things as part of just your regular development and staying connected with folks. Now, if you are in a situation where you haven't been doing these and now you're out of a job and you're looking for a job, then my conversation to you would change, because I think you do need to address the fact that what you don't want to happen is have this be an awkward conversation. And this will tie to something that I'm going to bring up in the interviewing thing later. But I think this is going to be an important piece where go into that conversation when you reach out, recognizing that, hey, I am looking for a new role, but that's my purpose. Be upfront with people. If your goal isn't to ask them to hire you, don't ask them to hire you. Tell them that be clear about what it is you want to get out of that conversation. The worst thing you can do is get into a virtual coffee and it's awkward as you both sit and look at each other and go, so what do you want to talk about, type of a thing. I think this is where it's really good to go into it being relentlessly curious. And maybe you want to reach out to this person because you're curious what the culture at that company is like. Maybe you want to hear how that company typically handles learning and development, and you want to understand what it's like to work on that team and how do the operations of that team work. Or maybe you want to learn more about a job that's a little bit outside of the role of L&D, and you want to understand how it may intersect or relate one of the things we talk about a lot is we want to be more focused on the business. Well, a good way to do that is to talk with people who are in the business, which, by the way, it's a really good career move to have people in your network who are not the ones who would be competing for the jobs you're looking for. And so by building relationships with people who are outside of your function, who can talk to you about who may be in there, they would be really good people that may know about or may have connections to jobs, and they're not necessarily interested in competing for them. Because if I'm the director of finance at a company, I'm not considering moving to a director of L&D role, but I may know the counterparts over there, and I may get to know you as a learning professional and go, wow, I'd really like to work with that person. I would be happy now to introduce and connect them in to the role that is in learning and development. And it's a non-threatening relationship. So all of that to say, and then I'm going to wrap this up here, is that the virtual coffees and the LinkedIn, when it comes to networking, to me are just two of the foundational bare bones. You should be doing this. You should be reaching out. And with the virtual coffees, what I will tell you is don't get discouraged if when you first start, you don't have a high response rate. You have to remember that a lot of people, when they get a message saying, I'd love to grab a virtual coffee, their immediate thought is, this person's looking for a job. And that may be an uncomfortable conversation in their mind. So help break that down. And if that's not your purpose, make that clear. And if it is your purpose, make it clear, but also let them know how they can help. Because I think sometimes that's where people get stuck is, that's great. You may be looking for a new job. I don't necessarily know how to help you with that. And if you can help set that stage. And the other thing is just get to know people on a personal level. I think that's one of the other things that can be really helpful in building your network, because then as they hear about things or they make connections, they can do that. And the last thing I will add on this virtual coffee piece, when you get the people who accept the virtual coffees, always make a point to ask, is there anybody based on what I'm doing that you think would be helpful for me to talk to after this? Because nothing will increase your success rate of getting a virtual coffee than a person you had a virtual coffee making a recommendation and making that introduction to someone else that you can have that virtual coffee with, so that it's not you reaching out to them and they have no idea who you are, but someone they're familiar with and they trust saying, I recommended that this person have a conversation with you. Whew. All right. So I'm an hour in. I'm going to take a break from this one and wrap right here. Just so you know, part 2, I'm going to focus on how to stand out in the application game. And what you can do with this is, how do you actually go about doing that and standing out in a sea of applications? And then how to do well in the interview piece. I'll talk about that. And we'll see how long that one goes. But hopefully this first chunk was helpful to you, for those of you who are looking at new jobs or looking for new jobs. And also for those of you who may not at this point, but are just thinking about, hey, what are some activities? Hopefully I highlighted enough things in there that regardless of what your status is, I think everybody should be doing these as part of their ongoing personal skill development and professional development. So with that, I'm going to call this the end of episode 1. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week, and we will see you for part 2.